Hello, everybody. My name is Philip Beckles-Raymond, and I'd like to welcome you to the second episode of Breaking Bread, a series of conversations hosted by the Black Thought Collective. We aim to provide food for thought that whets the appetite for collective imagination and action. In our first episode, you heard from the first half of our collective. We discussed thought in the context of power relations that inform how thought is conceptualized. We moved across a range of themes that converge on an understanding of thought as embodied and holistic. Today, I'd like to continue our discussion on thought. I'm joined by the other half of our collective, who I'm excited to introduce to you. Meet creative management consultant and DJ, Lynda Rosenoir-Patten.
Hi, everyone.
PhD researcher, Yogi, and health rights advocate, Lubumbe Velde. Emotional and behavior specialist, empath, and psychosocial critic, Lucinda Beckles.
Hey, everyone.
And interdisciplinary philosopher, educator, and consultant, Dr. Gabriella Beckles-Raymond.
Hi.
I want to get right into our conversation. And to kick things off, I'd like to read for you a quote from Zora Neale Hurston. In it, Hurston says, "There's a basin in the mind where words float around in thought, and thought unsung than sight. Then there's a depth of thought untouched by words, and deeper still, a gulf of formless feelings untouched by thought." I want to hear from you today. What are your reflections on today's topic of thought? Specifically, when you hear the word thought or thinking, what does it mean to you? What does it make you think of?
Well, thanks for that introduction, Philip. And I mean, for me, it's very profound that you chose a quote from Zora Neale Hurston. It's probably one of the first female novelists and feminists that I, was aware of coming up as a young woman. So to get to the question about thought and what the word thought conjures up for me, I can really only relate to that as someone who's a middle-aged Black woman who has, been on a kind of an interesting journey and come to a point in my life where the word thought really evokes, in many ways, a luxury that many of us are not afforded. The space to think, the space to really explore thought and what thought means in our daily lives, simply because we lead I've led a very full and challenging life. And it's only in recent years that I've begun to appreciate the importance of having space, literally having space to think and to reflect, and the value of reflection. Because in doing so, you begin to realize, in many ways, the journey that we've been on and the possibilities, as echoed in that quote, the yet uncharted possibilities if we were to fully harness, the power of thought. So for me, I can only really relate to that in my own journey. I think that I'm very kind of excited, despite being, having passed the landmark age of 60, to know that there is still much to be done, and that if I was to afford myself time to think and to reflect and to really kind of come into my own, and to know what the power of thought can really do, because I think it's almost like, as women, we often operate on a quarter tank. We produce a lot with oftentimes very limited resources, but the power to really kind of open up, the channel of thought to realize your full potential, and in so doing, I suppose, take advantage of opportunities and also recognize the greatness that we embody. And the reason why I say that is that one of the more recent manifestations of thought is this concept of thought leadership, and of kind of a bit of a buzzword that's been going around for a number of years. It's an old concept, but it's re-emerged as almost like a school of thought. And what it really kind of relates to is the residue of expertise that each of us as women have gathered, but we've never ever exploited, and oftentimes it's exploited by others. And I can testify that in my role, in my various roles that I've had in my professional life, having all this knowledge and expertise that often is, appropriated, and I've not really used to the best of my, in terms of the best of my, to my benefit, I should say. So for me, that's what the word thought initially conjures up with that.
A lot of what Lynda says really resonates with me as well. Except I would like to sort of take another spin on it. So one of the things, or for me, what really came up in thinking of what thought is the idea of being still. So being still in the present. And it's been such a powerful discovery for myself, mostly because of the many things that Lynda also mentioned. So the idea of having a space or creating a space to think. And I've realized that for most of us, or at least I'll speak from my own experience, thought is a lot of, conjures up sort of a lot of procedures, regulations, formulas, rules around who gets to think, what is thought, how to formulate it, how, so it's very regulated in that sense. It has to be written, it has to be spoken, and there's so much around it. And also you get feedback on, or just you get lots of thoughts in very different ways. So I was inspired by Fanon's, but Foucault. And this is ironic that I mentioned this now, because I'm always saying, well, if you think about anything that has to do with post-colonial thought, it's literally those two names, and now I just sort of had mixed them up. But the idea of polymorphous techniques of power. And so the idea that we sort of get so much input of thought, discourse, discussion, ways of being, ways of speaking, ways of making meaning of things from our family, from our friends, from education, medicine, legislation. So there's all this noise basically. And I find half of the time you don't even realize what your own thought is or where you are, what's your process. And so for me, one of the ways I've really thought about thought is really to really take the time to consider the many things that I, for myself, have found thought to be, which is a complex mechanism that is holistic, because it is my body checking in, right? Checking with my body, my mind, my spirit, my emotions, and really being still and wondering, okay, so I observe myself, I consider, I am silent, I take the time, I speak, but also I just am. And so a lot of that, comes up for me. And I realize often we also taught that thought is an expression, like a communication. So you either communicate it by writing or speaking or performing. And then all of that comes with rules, right? Because writing is then subdivided in all these categories and performance is subdivided. And I've realized that that's just, for me, one aspect of thought, right? To communicate it. There's a lot of it that happens internally before I can externalize it. So I think for now, I'll sum it up with that and then see what bounce off everyone else's thoughts.
I suppose when this, hello everyone. I suppose when this came about, this idea of thinking about thought, I was like, I don't know what I think about it. But actually I've spent a lot of my life thinking about how people think and how it makes you respond to life. And so for me, a lot of it is to do with how people reflexively view life and how those reflexivities or lack of them create people's narratives and ways of thinking about themselves and how that governs their behaviors. And I'm trying to always, within the things I do and talk about, make people try and unearth those things through thinking and seeing how we control our own thinking space or not, and how that impacts our life and how we actually view ourselves. Because ultimately, to me, thinking is your space for empowerment. And if it's being controlled by everyone else's versions, or you unaware of what those versions are to you, you're less likely to feel empowered or confident, or all the things we all know make us develop in life. So to me, that's something that's governed a lot of my thinking and ways of challenging myself and people around me in recognizing the strength in thought. And although others have mentioned the control of thinking, I've always been someone who's been quite willing to say, I don't give a damn, and I'm going to challenge people's thinking, whether it's something that's standard or not. I'm not willing to just accept it, even though I've succumbed to those things all the time. I'm very myself, and I know that I'm also part of it. It's definitely, to me, a fascinating space to be, or a fascinating place to engage in conversations with others and to open up and unearth things about yourself. And like Lulu, I suppose, suggested about the different levels of things, or what did you say? It was more, for me, what Drew I would thought about for me was something about silence. And Lynda mentioned this space of being able to, and I think coming older, for someone who's always been very fast and wanting to do everything 100 miles an hour, silence, the space of being afforded silence and just a time to actually reflect on what you think, even silence from your own self sometimes is a vital space that conjures up great thoughts, I think.
So if I can jump in now, and I kind of feel like I'm going to touch on a little bit of something all of you said, because for me, when I think about thought or thinking, I just get excited. It makes me think of the power of ideas. The empowerment and how profound thinking as an act of resistance can be. But even as I say that, I immediately become conscious of the fact that just saying that I'm excited about thought, I run the risk of being misunderstood, of perceived as some kind of geek or something. And I'm aware that that's because of the way our societies have conditioned us to think about thought in the ways that you all have kind of touched on. And so so I suppose I want to kind of set out for me some of the ways in which that confinement of thought and thinking has taken place, such that many of us feel alienated from the process. So there's first that kind of narrowing of scope of what thought is, the reduction of thinking to a kind of Western notion of rationality that's deeply problematic. And we heard a lot about that, both from yourselves, but also in the first episode last week about kind of challenging that notion so that we understand thought to be a holistic enterprise. And then there's also the exclusion of certain groups from humanity itself based on our assumptions about thought. So if you're Black, people are stereotyped as intellectually subhuman. And if you're a woman, you're stereotyped as emotional. And then that doesn't, and here I'm obviously talking about white women. If you're a Black woman, you know, in the context of that dual oppression, we're kind of excluded from the conversation about thought before we even get the chance to speak or think on it. And then thirdly, for me, there's this other kind of exclusion where the very association and attribution and who gets credit for thought activities is again directed to specific groups, and other people are disassociated from that. So here I'm thinking in the kind of most obvious sense, the intellectual legacy of Egypt and how that gets rewritten as a kind of Greek Western and therefore white paradigm. And so African peoples get kind of ruled out of or erased as the kind of ancient seat of wisdom that we rightfully were. Then you can think also of the many ways in which in modern academic times ideas are from Black people are often not cited even within the kind of agreed academic conventions, such that, you know, I'm thinking here from Du Bois to Kimberly Crenshaw, you know, where ideas from Black people are attributed to others or not given credit for. And, you know, so this kind of erasure. So for me, thought is about a reclamation. It's an act of resistance, as well as being actually a kind of, I suppose I don't want to leave on that act of resistance because it very much is in the context of Euromodernity, but it's also, I think we forget, just a natural state of human existence. It's a facet of being. And for anyone who's ever tried to meditate and done that exercise where you have to kind of blank your mind, and how difficult it is, like our mind is abuzz with thoughts all the time. And so to me, like I say, reclaiming thought and reminding ourselves of the power of thought is what comes to mind.
So I'm really glad to hear from everybody. And the synchronicity between what you all are saying. And I was just sitting down listening to you all and thinking about, Aretha Franklin sings that song, "It's Still Waters Run Deep." So this idea of stillness and space is really a rich space of excitement and pain and a commentary on justice and all that, right? And I mean, it brings up this question of, in this context we're in now, so we're on timeout, lockdown, whatever you want to call it, and you're left with space and stillness in some ways. Something I guess all of you have spoken about as being comfortable with, this idea of reflecting on one's own thought and thought of others. What will be said about this time might not be what we think, but we have thoughts on it. So tell me, what do you think are your views on how, thought could help us cope with the current context we find ourselves in, this COVID-19 situation, and all that it means and can mean? What do you all think?
Well, being a parent, somebody who is a mentor or in the middle of mentoring people from teenage years to kind of address and deal with this space, one of the things that's very clear to me is the different mindsets that people bring to what solitude means, and how those of us who think about it a lot are still being tested in that area. And I think that it's a wonderful time to make people have to reflect in ways that I've been passionately wanting to people for time. But it's also a time where those of us who think we're reflecting are caught with a kind of haze of, actually, all of this is going on and it's drawing me out of what I would comfortably be in a way that then makes you not do all the things you might thought of. So I think it's challenging different ideas and ways of thinking that you thought you had under control. But it's also, I think, a very powerful position or powerful place for us to sit in, because most people don't necessarily like the limbo of uncertainty, but some really wonderful, creative, innovative things come out of that kind of space and thinking, and it allows you to have to readdress the simple things that you kind of didn't consider before. Like, you're in your home, you figure you've got all these things and these gadgets and these people, and or not people, but things, your kids, their friends who want to talk all over the phone or whatever else. But actually, it's just nice to go and go, oh, I've got this book on the shelf that I've been meaning to read for 5 years, and now actually I've got time. Getting that book and then realizing actually you haven't got the concentration to bother to deal with it. So it's kind of this play on how you manage that space of solitude, but recognizing that it's a wonderful, fruitful place for lots of things to come of, and not to get lost in the narratives that get sent to you through media and everything else at this time. So I think I'm finding it testing, but in a way that I find uplifting. So it's a kind of a play of that space, and dealing with people who don't necessarily draw upon self-reflection. I'm very acutely aware of how they're finding it a lot more difficult, because actually this period of time is when we're all permanently distracted, even without thinking of our own thoughts, right? Everything external to us is telling us having everything instant, Instagram, Insta, whoever. And actually, all of that is like, it's not really important. And I think it's helping me show students how, as much as you find them significant and important, you've got to be able to be comfortable with your own headspace. And what does that headspace talk to you about? And so I'm finding it testing, enriching, and a wonderful. I'm optimistic. The 2020 is the vision. I'm hoping that brings people to see that 2020 is something that we can all have in these kind of spaces and see the good in things, I suppose.
Yeah, allow me to jump in here. I think thought is critical at this time of COVID-19. First and foremost, because it's essential for our political and social response to COVID-19. Simply because of the amount of information and misinformation that's going round. And particularly for us as Black people and Black women, given the kind of gross inequalities, not just in terms of whose lives are affected by COVID-19, but with respect to the pre-existing inequalities that have been exacerbated, we really have to put our minds to work to gather our own information, to be able to dissect the information that's been put before us, so that we can strategize about how on earth we're going to mobilize ourselves to minimize the damage that's been done to so many lives during this time. That being said, really, as Lucy kind of alluded to, there's another sense in which I think we just need to stop thinking. We need to block out the information, because I think we often rely on, or we're often fed the idea that the more information you have, then you have power. But sometimes if you don't have accurate information, the more thinking and the more trying to pay attention and keeping up with the stats and the numbers actually can send you mad. And so given the kind of scale of economic, social and psychological disruption that COVID's brought to our lives, whether it be from grief, loss, isolation, stress, uncertainty, whatever, I think that we really need to call on the resources of our spirit in order to cope with what is essentially an existential crisis. And when I say that, I'm conscious of the fact that, again, drawing back to the kind of discussions we had last time, is that here I'm not talking about those spiritual resources as separate from thinking. Like, I don't subscribe to that kind of dichotomy of the mind and the spirit, but rather both these sets of tools are part of an indivisible whole human capacities that are available to us in times of need that we really need to mobilize during COVID-19.
I think I'll sort of go back to, restating that I still, insofar as I'm, presenting the idea that for me thought is being present in the moment, I also have to sort of reflect as to what it means during these times. And one of the things that I just want to use as a way to clarify what I'm trying to say is the question, how are you? And and good morning, right? So I'll just relate with a bit of a story. Like, I grew up in a household where it's very important to ask someone how they are, and you can ask that multiple times a day. And so depending on the concept or the perception or the idea you have around that, right, the notion of asking someone how you are, you might find it odd that someone can ask you the same question multiple times in a day. But if you understand, and this sort of came to me later on, when there was a time when my mom sort of explained to me what she meant with that. If I say really checking in, being still and being present and being aware of how you are, and this is mentally, physically, emotionally, and intellectually, then you should also understand that at any given moment, all of that could change, right? Because there are a lot of factors that play into how you feel. So for me, thought is very much emotional, thought is very much spiritual, thought is very much, is malaise, whether I'm feeling ill or not feeling ill, my body is a discomfort or not. It's also whether, my heart is in pain. So there are all these things. And so all of that can happen in one split second, right? And so if you kind of like walk around and just be around in our society, a lot of people find it odd when you ask them how you are, or they'll give you sort of, we have these pre-bit answers, like almost accepted answers to saying how I am, which is I'm fine, and we stop at that, and you don't sort of give any further explanation to that. Or the other one is to really refer to disease or some physical discomfort, right? So you either, I'm not feeling well today, I didn't wake up well, so sort of that. And I just realized, like, one of the most important things, and when I say you, the you is so well me, but also everyone else. How are we all, right? Because we need to understand how we are, because that affects our perception of the world, but also it affects how we react, how we respond, really. And I think to think about how we respond to what's happening, both internally and externally. So thought, to me, definitely in COVID, is also a way of checking in again with yourself, but checking in with everyone around you and figuring out the many ways we can respond to the emotion. So not to just react, right? Because reaction can, is an attachment to some sort of emotion that you have, but to consider, to observe. And so even when we're talking right now, right, sometimes we need to think, like, are we really listening to each other? Are we really considering what the other one is saying? And there's a lot that's also not being said, but then that's physically being communicated, that's spiritually being communicated. So there's all of that. And I think if you allow yourself to pause with that and to be still, then we can think of ways in which this time is another opportunity to reassess our practice of thinking, which could, which changes every time, right?
Picking up, I think, on something that Lucy had said earlier in terms of self-reflection. And I think for me, one of the things I think that's brought into a wider kind of context as a consequence of COVID-19 is the fact that this is unprecedented. And so it's kind of like, even to ask the question, how do you feel? To even begin to understand and answer the question is difficult because we don't know how we feel. This is kind of like an unprecedented set of circumstances which we're just beginning to grapple with. And whether or not we can even understand what we feel, and then secondly, to communicate that, I'm not sure is possible. And I think another concern for me in terms of COVID-19, a problem that was in existence even before, was the extent to which social media was affecting young people in terms of their ability to think for themselves, and to really be at peace with themselves and as individuals, and the importance of solitude. I think social media for the younger generation has become an instrument through which a lens through which they live their lives and they interact with each other. And I'm not sure, I haven't thought this out fully, but it just strikes me that potentially, it's not probably the most appropriate space for young people to really fully understand what they think, because there's so much already put out there that, young people either follow, or that where is the space for really original, to enable them to have original thought, and the space to know that sometimes being on your own and not being totally connected to the half of the world and having all these followers, that it's okay to be by yourself, and that you'll be with your thoughts is enough, is what I'm trying to say. So COVID-19 has just further exacerbated that in terms of this alien space that we find ourselves in, and the mental impact in terms of the isolation and not being able to connect physically with their friends. How is that going to play out? And there's Gabby, I think, was saying, about being the preparedness post-COVID-19, about using this time as, whether we like it or not, being, it's about how we lead, how we take up the challenges of leaders in our various communities, and how we come together to begin to provide not necessarily solutions, but definitely strategies to deal with what's to come, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I wanted to come in there and say about the teenagers and that kind of thing, because that's something I kind of deal with a lot and have quite lots of opinions about. The way that my own child, but in the greater, in terms of my work and everything else, how you can very much see how impacted children are from not being able to be connected. And I've had a lifelong quest of trying to find connectedness, or what I feel is genuine connections with people, like through vulnerability and genuinely loving people for who they are, which is ultimately my goal in life, to make people realize that actually you can value, if you value yourself and are willing to be vulnerable, that level of connectedness is something that is priceless and meaningful beyond what people in this generation or many others seem to really see. And the way social media is used, like an example, an anecdotal example might be that my daughter was here with like 3 or 4 of her friends. The room is small. 4 of them are in this room, and they're all on Snapchat talking to each other in the same room. I literally couldn't. Anyway, I challenged them in this space and made them like kind of reflect on it in that moment. But they're so invested in how they're seen, what story they're telling, and it's exacerbated by the very nature and the style of the app in itself, which makes you have to always be involved, and if you miss it, you're not part of the loop. So it continuously encourages them to have to be what they actually believe is perfect, and they think it's a possible notion, which is something when I was younger, you understood that perfect wasn't a thing. So the whole idea of perfection has changed, and they think it's attainable if they've just got a filter on or they've got something. So they genuinely don't see themselves to be themselves in a genuine way, they have to have a facade. Whereas that, like, they went down to having pictures where they'd have their face over, hand over their mouth through what normally would be a teenage coy or shyness and understandable, became a thing that you were able to think you could identify like that and that be okay. It was normalized in a way that made them think that that's okay. Like, they think it's normal to go to an event and film it, and it's better that they film it than actually participate. And COVID, what's been interesting about COVID is that there's this thing, house party, that they're on chatting and they're all chatting. And in theory, it's the highlight of what they love doing. And now all of them, after the weeks are coming on, are getting very bored of it, and they're realizing that it's not enough. And I actually genuinely need connectedness in a way that I think actually, if this didn't happen, they wouldn't have necessarily arrived at seeing how absolutely important genuine connectedness to people that you love and care about, and having the face-to-face interaction with people, like true connectedness that comes with that. So I think that something I'm hoping, as I'm an optimist at heart, that will bring out what kids and adults, because adults are on their thing too, but bring out the joy and loving, connected space that comes out from without technology. And us adults, I think, could model it too, because equally we're on our gadgets too, in a way we think we're superior, but actually we're doing the same in our own version of it. And maybe that's something we all need to look at and question.
Yeah, and I want to jump in and just touch on a little something to pick up on what you said, Luce, is I think that this brings us back to the conversation we had last time about thought being an embodied experience. And we've kind of mentioned mind, body, and soul a lot today. But it really calls to mind, on the one hand, the way in which technology obviously allows many people to stay connected, but that we need to really think critically about what kind of connection that is, because there are all these other elements of our physiological processing, of our spiritual processing, that certain kinds of technology mitigate against or interfere with. And so, but I think that the reason that, you know, technology in this way has become so prevalent in this unkind of thinking way is precisely because of what I was talking about before, the ways in which certain kinds of thinking have been demonized, right? And so if we again expand the notion of thinking to include these spiritual things, we would know that there's knowledge in when you can just sense someone. That's a kind of knowing. When you can feel someone's energy, which you can't when you're talking through a screen as we are today. There is knowledge in that spiritual presence of our bodies and in our spirits that certain kind of technologies with all the best will in the world just cannot pick up. And so it's important for us moving forward, I think, to really stick with a more expansive idea of thought and connectivity, so that we give due credence and credibility to all the ways in which humans can come together.
So it's really interesting how you all bring up this contrast between connectedness and connection, right? So everybody is connected via mobile phones or some other form of technology, but actually what Lucy you're mentioning is about emotional connection, you know. Even Lulu, you mentioned the idea of how are you? That kind of opportunity to actually express connectedness, right? And I mean, all of you are mentioning this point of human connection, and in this space of lockdown, how are we actually drawing on that? You know, we often hear this idea of thinking in the space of, do we think too much? Is there overthinking, you know? Or are there times when thought isn't enough? How do you see that playing out in terms of what you've been discussing so far?
I don't think there's overthinking. I think there's worry, loads of worry. There is a lot of anxiety. There is a lot of fear, right? I think, and I think all of us have touched upon this in so many ways, that we get a lot of information. And so I think you kind of like making sense of everything that's available to you can just, at least this is how I see it, for me, it causes a lot of distress and discomfort and worry and anxiety and fear. But if I sort of go back to my initial assertion that for me, thinking is, or thought is really the ability to sort of be still and check in, then I don't think I can ever do too much of it, right? I don't think I can ever do too much of checking in, because like we've all said, there's so little space and time for it, right? And so just to be able to have a moment, and because also the thing is, often at times, and I think we've all mentioned it in so many ways, there isn't there's not a lot of, like the availability of expression is so limited, right? If you just think of it in terms of, I'll say something, like for me, I struggle a lot with saying something, like speaking about how I feel, mostly because I realize about like speaking on my thought is just, it's a distillation, right? You're asking of me to communicate to you something that I've been observing, something that I've been considering, something that I've been pondering over, something that I've been, so it's like it's a long process. And so if I tell you something, it's probably a snippet of something. And half of the times I'll take this back to both sort of work and private, where you can have, for instance, in academia, right? I've been taught to express my ways of thinking in legal terms, for instance, which differ from philosophical terms sometimes, which might differ from another discipline, right? And so just to be able to make intelligible, right? And this is when we get back to thought as logic and thought as the mind, just to be able to find the right words, but also to convey them in a way that gives meaning to how maybe I feel, but also how I see, how I hear, like just a full exploration. That's what kind of drives me in the overthought process, because it's trying to not make sense of where I am in my thoughts, but it's making sense of how to explain that or to make that clear to someone else, because they come in with their perception and expectations, and I also project certain expectations maybe of what I think they have from me. So there is a lot, and I think there is a lot of room for miscommunication, whether it's linguistic, whether it's emotional, it's so because there's so many lenses, and there is where I find the overthinking happens, because there's so much to be misunderstood, misinterpreted, misspoken. There's just a lot of space where a lot of that can go wrong. But if I just come back to myself, like Gabby says, oftentimes it suffices to me that I say, this feels right to me in this moment, and that's enough. Do you see what I mean? And that is not overthinking, because it feels right. And if you're close to me, maybe you feel that, and we share the physical space or the spiritual space or in the emotional space, and maybe you don't understand me at all as well. That's a possibility as well. So there's so much, but overthinking, I think, is mostly happens in that process when we're trying to make external a lot of the things that have happened internally and over time. And you get this moment, now write this, please explain to me that, or you know what I mean? And that to me is where the overthinking comes
in. So I wanted to come in and say, like, you started off by talking about anxiety, and that kind of, to me, is exacerbation of overthinking. That's, I suppose, what the definition of anxiety kind of is the overthinking. And so I would question the type of thinking people have. We were on the back of the COVID conversation, but anxiety is one of the things that will be rife at this moment, precisely because people will be overthinking with not much thoughts. And I suppose your comments about the internal space of being in the moment, and recognizing and being true to yourself is one of the things I encourage people to do, very aware of the fears that you just displayed when you say you want to get it out there and be correct and have it people interpret you in the way that you yourself want to be seen, or hope that you're communicating things right. And I encourage people to understand that space is a valuable space of vulnerability that can develop connectedness, and the kind of vulnerability and connectedness I'm suggesting I would like comes from those spaces of people having the courage to say, it doesn't matter how I package this thing, this is me, and you don't know my whole backstory and I don't know yours, but in this moment this is what I'm offering. And I come often sometimes seen as abrupt in the way I deliver my information, precisely because I don't care what you think in the same way that I suppose society suggests we ought to. I do care in my own ways, and I have my own limitations within that. But to me, I want that rawness. I want people to know that it can't possibly be the sum of you in this one sentence or this one essay or this one conversation. And those kind of things that unfold allow us to share connectedness, especially in the Black community where we're always rubbished or our thoughts not allowed. And as Black women particularly, you're not allowed to have a voice, or it's silenced, or you're seen as this angry Black woman. And I'm like, well, anger as a thing is a good thing. It depends how you use it and what it's seen. You misinterpret passion for anger. There's so many different ways people frame you and box you in with language and thought in a way that I'm just like, well, fuck it. Just do that. Be you and let people learn that this is a healthy way of sharing ourselves. And it's such a lovely, valuable connection you can have with people when they're able to free themselves from the confines of what people teach us we ought to do with our thoughts and our words. Like swearing, like I just did, and people know that I'm up for a good old swear word. Sometimes it's completely inappropriate, and I absolutely understand that, but there are loads of times when that's the only thing that works, and people might take offense to it, but it still has an emphasis that's useful, and it's in every language you can think of. It can't be there for no reason. So learning how those things trap us, or like anxieties, and the way that we have those narratives that run over in our head over and over again that limit us from being able to actually share and be connected in a genuine way and say, actually, I'm human. I make mistakes. What I said just now might not be all right for you. And I'm sorry if that, well, let's talk about it. But if you're there trying to compartmentalize it into a way that makes it make sense to everyone with all of the baggage they bring, we're never going to get to what actually matters. And I think like with this COVID thing, it allows you to realize there's lots of things that just don't matter in the way that we've fought for so many years did. And so I think that that's allowing yourself to be vulnerable, challenge your thoughts. If we get the pleasure of having time to articulate them on the head, that's wonderful, but it's still okay to just throw it out there. And so many wonderful moments come out of off the cuff things, like we're just going to have a little jam. The Black community is known for those kind of cultural things that excite us, and people across the planet are jealous of because they can't create that. They haven't found the ways to box it in and make it in a way that's logical to them in their thought processes. And for me, I'm like, do that as often as you possibly can, because there's so much possibility that comes out of freeing yourself from those confines.
Yeah, I entirely agree. Agree. Oops, in the name of mistakes. I think you're absolutely right. And that's what I was talking about before, this kind of tyranny of rationality. We just need to just discard it immediately, as you know, in all its manifestations, not because there's not a place for critical thinking. Critical thinking I'm a great fan of. It's crucially important, but it is one way of thinking. And so for me, the question, I'd rather reframe it. It's not so much as whether we can overthink or think too much. It's whether we can deploy the appropriate kind of thinking given the task at hand and the setting that we're in. And here I also want to remind us that I'm talking here about a holistic understanding of thinking. And so what I mean by that then is, if we really take that notion of a holistic thinking seriously, it means that we can invoke ideas such as muscle memory and the knowing that our body contains with it. It means that we can speak of collective consciousness and ancestral knowledge and critical thinking and knowing our minds. So all these are perfectly legitimate ways of thinking, right? And so then to me, the question is, well, are you using the right kind of thinking or the appropriate kind of thinking at the right time? So for example, if I'm trying to get directions to a new place, like somewhere I haven't been before, muscle memory is not going to get me there because I haven't been there before, right? However, my critical thinking, whether I can work out my directions, you know, and whatever, and read the map, and possibly even my ancestral memory, if I'm going back to a sense of homeland that my spirit carries in it, then maybe those kinds of knowledges and ways of thinking are important. But if I'm just trying to get to a fast food chain, unless I'm a descendant of the Colonel, I don't need my spirit knowledge at that time. You know what I mean? So to me, it's to be free enough to use all the kinds of thinking we have at our disposal. And like Lucy says, really not to allow the pressures of the what should I be doing to impact our exploration of our own ways of thinking.
And I would just like to echo what both Gabby and Lucy said. I think that, so can you hear me? I think that whilst you were speaking, the thought that came to my mind was kind of like a reclamation of the power of instinct, you know, our instincts, it's sort of just to rely and trust on our instincts. And I say that as someone who comes from a generation where we were, as women, as Black women and Black children, girls in particular, we were seen and not heard. So it was never encouraged to be heard. And that continued into my life as a kind of like a 16-year-old kind of political awakening, beginning to, you know, have a sense of, you know, the world and the injustices that existed, and really relying on my instincts. And often because, I mean, at times, you know, if I'm honest, there was oppression that came from even within the struggle, because, you know, oftentimes it was the males that were the voices and the leaders, the self-appointed leaders, and oftentimes the women, the most prominent women, often would mimic a lot of the behaviors of the male leaders. And whilst I was a dedicated, you know, community activist, looking back, I had to rely on my instincts. It was always about how could I make the struggle relevant for the everyday person. I wasn't, you know, about learning about all the, you know, the philosophers and the thinkers and being able to quote Franz Fanon backwards. That wasn't really what it was about for me. It was about how you can engage the average person, single mother, you know, family man, struggling on a restricted, you know, means and salary. How can they really tap into the struggle? How could they make a contribution? And it was really about making the struggle real. And so for me, when I can only reflect now, and that was all based on instinct. My instinct was, how can I make the struggle practical? How can I make a contribution? When in Mozambique, you know, there was brothers and sisters who were, you know, through war and unrest, being maimed by mines. You know, remember the whole hoo-ha of Princess Diana being at the forefront. Way before she even started doing that, we were organising collectively in the community to raise funds and means by which we could fund the prosthetics that were needed in those locations. So it was about making the struggle meaningful for everyday people, and decoding it. I mean, I don't know, you know, but for me, that's what it was about. And as a young person who was just trying to find a way, I didn't have a physical voice, but I could act, and for me, it was always about actions. Actions speak louder than words, but I was propelled by my instincts. So that's the point I'm trying to make. And I think, you know, that Lucy really kind of encapsulated that, and I'm kind of very encouraged that you are kind of, you know, the work that you're doing with young people and being a young person yourself, that is what we want to encourage, you know, to speak, you know, and speak and be damned. It doesn't really, you know, it's about having a voice. We're not always going to get it right. We're not always going to communicate, as Lulu was saying, exactly what we're feeling at a given time, but it really doesn't matter. The important thing is to have a voice and to rely on your instincts, because the instincts will get you far, will take you far.
So I think there's a lot in the conversations you've been having so far about the relationship between thought and other aspects of your lives and other aspects of being, really. I remember trying to, like, you look up certain people that you hear about, Black women who have done a lot in history. And you sort of find yourself wanting, as I did, I guess, and you know, you want to write a paper on them. And you go to find out, okay, let me go and find the thought of someone like Ella Baker, you know, who you know have done so much. But she didn't write books as such because that wasn't the work she was doing, you know what I mean? And this idea of, you know, thought as work, you know, I'm thinking to do, not thinking to muse on an idea, and not because I can't, but actually because what I prefer to do, what's more meaningful for me, is to actually marshal that thought into action via feeling or not, or just, being in a way that's really specific to purpose, I wonder if we could sort of extend that conversation a little more, just this relationship between thought and other aspects of life. What do you all think about how thought can and does inform being? In addition to all that you've said so far, because I do feel you anticipated the question in lots of ways. But is there anything else you'd like to add in that space? Anybody?
I suppose I'll talk. I think that I had a conversation with Gabby actually the other day, but we're talking about being a woman and what it means to kind of aspire to excellence, and how we're talking about the kind of dogged determination it takes and single-mindedness it takes to often for people to get to excellence, and how actually as a woman and a Black woman, that option from the off is already not, you're always thinking about something other than just a single-minded thing, because you've got so many things to juggle. The notion that you could just be the best at any one thing is just something I've never had the privilege to consider, because you've had to consider your kids, you've had to consider other people's health, you had to be someone who looks after someone, so that you're always doing and usually doing for others in a way that doesn't allow you to have excellence in the way that we're taught we should have. And if you're somebody who's of intelligence or someone who aspires to do better and be better, you have to kind of reconfigure what it means to be excellent and how it can be projected or shown to others or accepted by yourself. Because if I say, well, I want to be the best at, I don't know, even if it's being a mum, I've still got other things to do, because society said, well, you're being a bum, that's not enough. You still got to work and you've got to give to the society, even though in my eyes, being a parent is the best, if you do it well, the best way you can add to the society, because you're developing the next generations and school and thinking in a way that will impact way more than any job I might actually do. But I do want to do more than be a mum, and that alone makes me already limited to being the best in any field I choose to pick. It's already limited just with that one variable. And most Black women, I'm still in a privileged position in the way that I'm here in England, and I've got privilege that many people across the planet don't have. So I think it's a privileged space to be, to have excellence. And I think that we collectively need to learn ways that we can value and honor what excellence means in all its different facets, so that we don't have to be the best at one solitary thing. I think if women were able, and men, all of us, and anyone who identifies as anything in anywhere else, I think it's important that we recognize that we have to reevaluate what it means to think, to be successful, to be empowered, to have a voice, who validates it, what modes of communication. Like we're always taught it's got to be through education, and I've struggled with that my whole life in terms of that notion of what it means to be intelligent in relation to academics, and allow for the millions of ways that people enrich our world with things that aren't the supposed status quo normal version of things, that actually are way more enriching and far more fulfilling to those of us who have to experience life in these kind of multifaceted ways.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And one of the things that you touched on here again, I think, is the way, as I was speaking before, that what we understand thinking to be has become so narrow. And really to pick up also on what Lynda was saying before about instinct. And for me, that narrowing is that thinking has become, or thinking in the rationalistic Western sense of it, has become viewed as the top of the hierarchy of human excellence in some senses, and whereby all other modes of human being have been denigrated in relation to this notion of thinking, this narrow version of thinking. And so for me, the relationship between thought and activities is really, again, really to reframe the question that if we really take seriously the integration of thinking and the connectivity, such that we don't do this decompartmentalizing, we don't do this separation, that we really come to understand human existence as, and Lulu touched on this as well, as being present in all our multifarious ways that we think. And so to me, this reframing of thinking then opens up a whole world of possibilities where the kinds of excellences that I think Lucy and Lynda, you were talking about, really can be recognized, because ultimately it's a kind of, like you say, it's what's valued. And so for me, I imagine, for example, how different our lives would be if we increased our level of emotional intelligence. I think we've all touched on at some point the fact that thinking, and I think we were really kind of talking about thinking in this rational, reflective thinking as being a privilege. But all these other activities that we're talking about that we do on a daily basis are kinds of thinking too. The amount of thinking that goes into being responsible for other people that's what sometimes is what causes tiredness. You know, when people say to women, oh, what have you done all day? Well, do you know how much energy it takes to have to juggle? Like, you know, and so to me, this reframing of thinking opens up a world of possibilities, like so where we can hone and be respected for honing different kinds of thinking. So imagine we really learned empathy. If we really knew the difference between empathy and sympathy, for example, imagine what our lives would be like if you could read someone's body language, like, I mean, really read it, and their micro expressions, and understand their need for psychic self-preservation and how it impacted how they respond to you. If you hone those kinds of knowledges, those instinctive emotional intelligences, imagine the arguments and misunderstandings that you'd avoid, that Lulu was kind of alluding to before. Imagine if we could exercise our moral courage muscle and had the cognitive and spiritual tools to invoke it on demand. Like, how powerful and at peace with ourselves would we feel? And so for me, the ultimate point is to reframe thinking such that it includes all these things. I mean, imagine if you could dance uninhibited to the rhythm of your own soul. Like when I said at the beginning, you know, it's the possibility of these kinds of things that get me excited. When I was talking about being excited about thought, that's what's exciting to me. Like, imagine what our lives could be.
I mean, I fully agree with you know, the kind of analysis that you've made, Gabby, and kind of as a way forward. And going back to the concept of instinct, and you know, I've always believed in kind of like the art of the possible, not knowing, you know, that kind of just try a thing, you know, it's kind of instinct, but kind of like having faith. I believe 100% that part of our salvation lies in how we can harness all of what we've spoken about, and you know, our ability to be resourceful, to be creative, as a, you know, as tools to address a lot of the challenges that we face. But I also believe, and I've had evidence of it, you know, real undisputed evidence of how actions speak louder than words. You know, oppressed communities need to see, you know, where there is possibilities. You know, they need to see firm action that leads to evidence that can provide the environment for all the things that you mentioned, Gabby, in terms of emotional intelligence, moral courage. But, you know, desperate times call for desperate measures. You know, we're in a time of real great uncertainty, but we have a massive potential to do good things. And I just want to sort of cite one example. I didn't know until maybe 7 years later the impact of, you know, a carnival, a local community carnival, which was literally a couple of hundred people gathering on Portobello Green in 2013. And then after input and really kind of putting in resources in place and getting people to think that things are possible, 7 years later, that small community festival is now part of the official carnival. It really is kind of the kickoff for carnival. And in terms of the power of that community knowing that we control this is ours, we made this happen, is immeasurable. So sometimes you need to, you know, people need to see and feel, you know, they need to see and feel what's possible. You know, it's kind of like the thought alongside action, if that makes sense.
Lynda, you make such a strong point there, and I think it's one that sums up a lot of what we've said so far, this idea of thought and action being indelibly linked, and, you know, casting down one's energies, which really is a sort of core element of thought, energy, into something crystallized in the world. I think if we took away the unseen, what we validate and stuff as being thought or as being something worth valuing, tends to lose its luster. There's so much more we can say today, obviously, and I'm going to want to pull things to end only for the sake of time, but with a sense of wanting to invite us to come again at this conversation, whether it's this topic or another one. There's so much rich stuff we touched in here. Thanks to everybody for, sharing your time, sharing your thoughts, and being present with us today. We are the Black Thought Collective. See you soon.
See you later.
Bye-bye. Thank you. See you later.
Bye.